Hello and welcome to episode 2 of my E30 318i restoration series. In this episode, sparks go flying, we tear the car a new one, I rescue some brake calipers from a shipwreck and make them shiny again, spend too much time detailing the airbox, do an unnecessary oil change, just to waste money, and we discover a new technology, Bluetooth transmission mounts. We begin this episode with a compression test, a very basic test of the engine's ability to perform one of the crucial tasks in the combustion process, producing compression. The engine passed the test with relatively homogeneous compression across all 4 cylinders, though it was unusually high for this engine, likely the result of carbon buildup, which we will address in a very cathartic manner in a future episode. Since the spark plugs were already out, I decided it was a good time to replace them. I added a bit of dielectric grease to the terminals to ensure ease of ignition coil removal in the future. These get torqued to 18.4 foot-pounds, or 25 newton meters. Next, I'm addressing the brakes. The brake pedal did essentially nothing when I bought the car, so I decided to do a full rebuild. They were so rusty and the fluid was so dirty, I knew I couldn't simply bleed them and call it a day. If you didn't catch what just happened, one of the rotor screws stripped when I tried to remove it, requiring me to drill out the old threads and tap new ones with a tap and die set. Here I'm treating these very rusty brake calipers with phosphoric acid, a rust converter to convert the rust into iron phosphate, a hard black material that's easy to paint over, and hopefully prevent these calipers from rusting in the future. I think I could have applied more layers, but with each layer taking 24 hours to dry, I decided it was simply too time-consuming to do more than one. After the surface dries, it's necessary to remove the white flaky crust that can form in some areas.
it's integral to clean out these caliper guide pin bushing retainer areas, because what can happen is, even though the pin itself slides on the bushing, if there's any imperfection in the surface here, that imperfection can translate into the bushing, which then can cause the pin not to slide smoothly. So I'm going to be cleaning that up, and that's the reason. All right, so I'm gonna now fill these with some grease. The tighter seal goes around the pin here. So the tighter seal goes around there. Then I'm gonna put more grease on here. And then I'm going to put that in there. And then this seal goes around here, like that. Unfortunately, you know, doing things to this level, even if, you know, I am making some mistakes, but say I was an expert mechanic, doing things to this level, you know, obviously most people, they're not looking for it. Most cars don't really kind of deserve it. In fact, I mean, certainly my E30 doesn't. So I'm gonna put some grease on there. Doesn't technically deserve it because it's not worth a lot of money. But in the YouTube world, things don't have to make sense, and that's part of what makes this fun. Because, I mean, taking these brackets off, painting them, you know, spending days prepping them for paint, and then replacing every single piece and making them perfect like this really doesn't make sense in the quote-unquote real world. But I love it anyway. In fact, I especially love it because it doesn't make any sense. Well, here's the finished product. I'm quite pleased with it. This caliper needs to be touched up a bit because there are some nicks in the finish. I'm excited to install these parts. I'm really excited to feel how the car stops Once these parts are installed, it's going to stop a lot better than it goes. This is pretty much as full a rebuild as one gets. So obviously there's going to be a huge juxtaposition here between the very rusty hub, control arms, shock tubes, and sway bar links and everything. Frankly, I'm not too concerned about this right now. I just want to get the brakes working. I want to get the systems in this car that are currently not functioning. For now, I'm just going to clean up the mating surfaces and we'll go from there. So it's very tempting to simply bolt everything up and assume that it will work out just fine, but it's crucial to make sure that components can slide properly. So these brake pads have to slide on the brackets without sticking at all. So I'm going to just sand down these surfaces a little bit, make sure they're perfectly smooth, although it's frustrating because it slightly damage this really nice finish. The fact of the matter is it's more important that it functions properly and you won't see it anyway. So I'm going to apply more of this brake paste to the actual pad here. Apply some paste to the other pad. Anywhere where the brake pad touches another surface. And the paste like that. And I'm going to apply it to these little brackets that kind of hold the brake pad in. I actually found it necessary to run out to the hardware store to grab a very thin 15mm wrench for this because the clearance is not sufficient to stick a typical 15mm open-ended wrench in there, so you actually need one that's quite thin.
in the top drawer of that gray toolbox. Oh, that one. There, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, you press that little black button.
So definitely not perfect, but a little cleaner at least.
Here I'm replacing the brake master cylinder. You may notice in the next segment when I bleed the brakes that the original master cylinder is still in place. That's because after an initial brake bleed, I test drove the car and realized that while the rebuild had been successful, the pedal was still a bit soft. The master cylinder for this car is no longer available new, so I replaced it with one from an E30 7 series. It's an easy fit and supposedly provides slightly better brake feel. Not sure how visible this is, but there's a good deal of rusty, dirty particles going through the brake line here and bottle. So yeah, clearly this braking system extremely neglected, as was immediately obvious when I just looked at the calipers. Especially it was visible when you saw the brake fluid reservoir and how dirty that was. And you can just see some of the residue from that going through this line here. Well, the third corner is nearing completion here. In fact, fluid's looking good, and I'm not seeing any bubbles, so I think I'll be finishing this one up pretty soon. I'm very, very excited to see if this whole process yields results. Now that the brakes are bled, I'm going to do some basic maintenance, starting with replacing the air filter. I already had the box out because I was replacing this brake line, so these nuts aren't on here very tight. But I'm going to take the whole box out, even though it's not strictly necessary because I want to clean it. That's how I would consider a proper airbox service to be done. So that's what I'm going to do, as opposed to just replacing the filter, which is fine, but there's going to be dirt in the airbox, and that's going to kind of clog up the filter prematurely. And also, it just feels right when you're going as far as I am with this car to do things in a way that's not just an ordinary service, but is in a way restorative to a greater degree than normal overall general maintenance would be. So as you can see, the airbox is quite dirty, and obviously this filter is what prevents that dirt from going into the engine. But I obviously don't want to just leave it like this and have all of this dirt get sucked up into the new filter. This filter is clearly disintegrating, made in Canada. Interesting. I don't see a date on it. So yeah, it's pretty dirty. I'm just going to remove the mat to clean this part. I will be replacing this gasket, but for now I don't have one, so I'll just be putting this back together as is, and it should work fine. Due to this power steering fluid reservoir and the lines leaking, there is quite a bit of fluid here that's kind of coagulated and collected a lot of dirt. So that's underneath the filter. I'm going to be cleaning that out before I put the filter back in. Now this hose situation down here is not great. There's just duct tape on it, so at some point soon I'll address that. It's kind of seemingly rendering this useless, but for the time being I'm just going to replace the boot here. New intake boot going in with the 90-degree here, which again I'm not sure if this is original. Certainly know this duct tape isn't, but seems like it's been working, so I'm going to just install it like this for now, and then end up finding a proper hose clamp, one that actually fits properly, and then try to figure out what's happening with this hose situation and remedy that. This clamp is definitely not the original, so it's kind of a tough fit, and it doesn't really fit in this kind of groove here, so I will find a better one, but for now I'm just going to reinstall it. Alright, airbox going back in. This new intake boot is just so much softer and suppler. Time to do an oil change, starting with removing the filter, which is, the top is held on by a 13mm bolt. I believe this was changed recently. Well, this oil was changed not very long ago at all. The filter is looking good, and actually I'm glad to see it's a man filter. Probably not necessary to replace the filter or the oil, frankly, but I'm going to go ahead and do it just because we're here. I'm doing basic maintenance, and I want to make sure that we're getting the grid oil that I want to try running in this engine so that I can diagnose any issues with the way it runs from a starting point where I know what fluids are in the car. Oh yeah, this oil is definitely very, very fresh. And it was kind of a shame not to have done an engine flush. However, there was another very specific reason I didn't do an engine flush, which I'll explain in the future. But for now, oh well, we're just doing a slightly unnecessary oil change. I assume these O-rings were replaced when the oil was changed, so it's not strictly necessary to do it, but I'm just going to replace them anyway, just in case. Just given the texture, I'm thinking this and how easily it broke. I'm thinking these actually were not replaced. Alright, so I'm lubing up the O-rings here, and by the way, I'm using an oil with an additive in it, which is why it looks dark, but it's not dirty. It just has an anti-friction additive in it. So that's why the oil is going to look essentially like dirtier oil than the oil we just pulled out of the car. Alright, drain plug going back in with a new crush washer. Alright, pre-lubing the filter here. Put the cap on, thread the bolt on, and then tighten it down with 18 foot-pounds of torque. So the oil capacity for this engine is around 5.3 quarts, which is roughly the size, almost exactly the size of this container here. So since we already have some in the filter, I'm going to be pouring most of this in here, but leaving just a little bit. A quick transmission fluid service, and you may notice in some of these clips that the transmission bushings, the mounts, are red. That's because I initially replaced them with poly bushings, but decided against it due to the increased NVH. It may have been improved by replacing the motor mounts with poly mounts as well, which I did plan to do, but I decided to go for all OEM mounts for the drivetrain. This transmission drain bolt is magnetic, and as you can see, we do have some metal shavings on it. This transmission presumably is original and has probably close to 200,000 miles, at least 170 something thousand. So I'm going to clean these off. So the torque spec for these plugs varies quite widely, but I'm just going to go somewhere in the middle, which is 50 Newton meters. By the way, what I'm using is Redline D4 ATF for this job. It may have been a bit difficult to see what I was doing there, but I just filled up the transmission, and now I'm tightening the fill plug with my ratchet here. I'm not using my torque wrench because I can't fit it, and I don't think this really matters quite as much as the drain plug. So So it's crucial to take out the fill plug first. This is not something I typically see people do. However, I like to do it regardless, and that is I like to flush the diff out. So I like to pump just a little bit of fluid in, and then I kind of just let that drain out. And I mean, you can see dirt coming out with it, along with some additional old fluid, so I do think it is worthwhile, even if it is a bit of a waste. Reapply the drain plug. I'm torquing these drain and fill plugs to 41 foot-pounds. These are probably the worst condition transmission bushings I've ever seen. Well, there's a severed half of the transmission mount. When I said in the first episode that New York State inspections for cars are totally ridiculous and a joke, this is what I meant. I mean, how did this car pass any sort of inspection with transmission mounts that are literally Bluetooth? I mean, there's no physical connection between the transmission and this cross member here. It was just resting on it. Well, I think I can only really reach one of these to torque them, but this gets torqued to 31 foot-pounds. The other one is kind of blocked by the exhaust, and frankly, I don't feel like it's worth taking the whole exhaust down, so I'm just going to torque it by feel. Well, I was confused for quite a while because this engine mount bolt didn't seem to be a 16 or a 17. It seemed to be somewhere in between. But it turns out the 17 spins on it because, well, it's totally loose. So that's a bit strange. Yeah, I'm replacing the motor mounts. There's a washer, a nut, and then same thing up top, I think. But yeah, that's strange. There was absolutely no torque on that whatsoever. On that. engine mount. In case you can't see what's going on here, there's a long extension that goes all the way down to the engine mount, all the way down there. And getting to that nut, well, let's just say it's not easy to break it loose because the loss of torque that you have from all of these extensions. But I managed to get it loose with a wrench from below, and then I used a series of extensions, a swivel, and a 17 mil. And it's coming out now. Here we go. Alright, so the next step is to lift up the engine by the oil pan. Just gently lift it up. I have a rubber pad in between my jack and the pan. And going up high enough allows us to reach in and hopefully grab the engine mounts out of the way. There's one engine mount out. This is the left-hand side, or driver's side one in this case. This one actually doesn't look too bad. I know the other one looks much worse, but it's definitely old. Here's a comparison of old versus new. Obviously the old one has been compressed quite a lot. There's a much more dramatic comparison between this old one and this new one. As you can see, this one's very compressed. This is on the side that the engine leans on. But yeah, these mounts definitely needed to be replaced, especially this one. It's got cracks in it separating there, and it's extremely compressed. They obviously are not compressed like the old ones, so the engine needs to go up even higher. And it's already at a height that I'm kind of not comfortable with, and they still, at least this one, still doesn't seem to want to go in. And with that, we end episode 2. Of course, there's a lot more to be done, so this series will continue, though the next time you see me, I'll be working on my new project, something a bit newer, more luxurious, and with a much larger rear end. If you're interested in seeing it before I post my next video, follow me on Instagram. Stay tuned for that, and thank you for watching.